Okay, so in this video, we are going to look at induction in COQ using two examples. And we are going to use this inductive definition for less or equals from the standard library within COQ to drive our examples. This definition takes an input n of type natural numbers, and it spits out a proposition. So we see that this definition has two constructors. The first one only takes one input as basically n, and it's pretty straightforward. It basically states that n is equal or smaller or less than n, and this is pretty trivial. For the second constructor, it takes a successor of a number. So in particular, it says that for all m, which is an input of type natural numbers, if n is less or equal to m, the implication tells us then that n is also less or equal to the successor of m. So to begin, we are going to prove a simpler lemma, and that is that 0 is less or equal to n for all n, and so this is the definition. This was the name. This is saying that our lemma applies to for all n, and this is the actual lemma, which is very short in this case. And for our proof, we are going to introduce n. And now notice on the right side of my screen, when I start, it shows me the definition of my lemma for all n and for 0, as we showed here. We're saying for all natural numbers n, 0 is less or equal to n. And then when we go to proving and we introduce n, notice that things above the line are facts that we already know. In this case, we specifically know that n is a natural number, and we're trying to prove that n is greater or equal to 0, or 0 is less or equal to n. Now, if you have taken a course in logic, or specifically if you know induction, you know that n could be any number that has been constructed starting from 0 in an inductive way. So in particular, we once upon a time started with 0 and then just kept adding successors to 0 to get to n. So like, let's say we had n0 equal to 0, and then we just had a successor of n0, which in this case was 1, and we added on until we got to n. There was a path that allowed us to construct n starting from n0. So we had to use the 0 constructor for n, which allowed us to create n0 once, and then in addition to that, we also had to apply the constructor that uses the successor n times to arrive at the number n. So basically, this lemma that we are coming up with here, what it's trying to prove is the existence of this path from n0 to n. So just knowing the above, we cannot make progress on this proof. We cannot just tell COQ, hey, use either of these constructors to make any progress, because the format of what we're trying to prove doesn't really fit the shape of the constructor. So in this case, the tactic we are looking for is induction, because this proof is an inductive proof. There is a path from n0 to n, and we can just use that here. Here it is. We say induction n, and now we get two subgoals, because it inducted on n, and it understood from our usage of this function here that the ways we could have arrived at n were two different possible paths. Well, this constructor only takes one number, so if we supply 0 to it, it just so works that the second number has to be 0 as well. So it understands that and gives it to us as a goal. And the second constructor we see here works with successors. So it says that the successor of n, if we assume that there was an n where 0 was less or equal to it, then the successor of n is also such that 0 is less or equal to it. Okay, so now we have to prove these two goals separately. We start with the first goal, and I just like to do this to get that goal isolated. And once I do that, I can apply the first constructor, and that takes care of the first goal because the format fits exactly. And then for the second goal, I apply the second constructor. Also, we have another fact. We have an inductive hypothesis in this case, and the inductive hypothesis is basically giving us what we need in this case. We now know that there is an n, and we could have arrived at n using a path from 0, and 0 is less or equal to that n. And now that we have this fact, we can go from this n to its successor by applying that fact, and that finishes our proof. Now notice the reason we had to use this second fact was that this was our inductive case. Now let's look at the second example. Now in this example, we will use induction to prove transitivity about less or equal. And I'm going to use 3 variables here. So for all A, B, and C, if A is less or equal to B, and I know also that B is less than or equal to C, I should know that A is less or equal to C as well. Okay, so let's talk about the proof. But before doing that, let's just load everything in our environment all the way down there. This is just what we defined, and now we need to prove it. So in this case, because we have a couple of implications, we can introduce them to our proof. So I'm going to introduce these two facts, or these two first implications that we are getting as well. And these are the facts that we know. We know that A is less or equal to B, and B is less or equal to C. These are not connected to each other at this point. We still have to work towards proving this entire thing that we're trying to prove. But these are individual facts that we know. We know that we are assuming that A is less or equal to B, and B is less or equal to C. And our goal is to prove this last fact. Now, I'm newer to the world of COQ, but usually when we are trying to do proofs for lemmas, if it's an inductive proof, we try to use the connective tissue in the middle where most of the facts are connected to each other by that piece of information that we have. And in this case, it just so happens to be this relation of B being less or equal to C. We will go ahead and induct on that. And that gives us two goals. And the reason for that is that there are two constructors for less or equals. Notice something magical happened here. Before this point, our goal was to prove that A is less or equal to C. But now that we made this induction, we have two separate goals. And the first one that we are going to step into explicitly says A is less or equal to B, which just so happens to be this other fact we know up here above the line. And the reason for this taking place is that COQ is realizing for this first constructor case to exist, B should have been equal to C. So it just goes ahead and replaces replaces C with B everywhere. And by knowing this fact, it can just take it away as a goal that we had. And we just now have to prove this fact. But in this case, we can just apply what we know above the line. And that takes care of our first goal. So in our induction case, C also disappears, but now, as you saw, it got replaced by the successor of M. And M here is a new variable given to us in our definition. So an easier way to go about this here is to use our constructor, or our second constructor to be exact. And applying our second constructor gives us a fact about another relationship. By our second constructor, when we apply, we know that A must have been less or equal to M as well. And then the other fact that we know is our inductive hypothesis. So we just go ahead and apply that, and notice that is exactly what we have below the line. So that finishes the proof for us. QED. And this is a specific example of induction on a derivation. Notice in this case, we inducted on something that was proof-like, something that was a fact instead of an input or a variable, which turned out to be a more powerful tool in our toolbox than just inducting on our variables.